America is being torn apart, not by foreign enemies, not by open invasion, but by something far more subtle and far more dangerous: ignorance weaponized as virtue. Every week, crowds gather in American cities chanting slogans, waving signs, and denouncing immigrant enforcement agencies as evil, fascist, or criminal. They believe they are standing on the moral high ground. They believe they are defending the oppressed. They believe they are resisting tyranny. What most of them do not understand is that they are not resisting anything at all. They are being used by media narratives that thrive on outrage, used by political operatives who monetize emotion, used by NGOs that profit from chaos, and most disturbingly of all, used by international criminal organizations, including some of the most violent cartels on earth. This is the modern reality of asymmetric warfare in the 21st century. The battlefield is not land. The weapon is not guns. The target is not soldiers. The battlefield is public perception. The weapon is narrative. And the target is you. To understand what is happening today, you must understand how cartels evolved. In the 1970s and 80s, cartels were primarily drug trafficking organizations. They smuggled cocaine, heroin, and marijuana across borders using violence and bribery. Their power was limited to specific corridors and regions. But by the 1990s, that changed. Cartels began transforming into transnational criminal enterprises, not just selling drugs, but running human trafficking networks, weapons smuggling operations, money laundering systems, cyber crime units, extortion rings, and black market labor pipelines. They stopped being gangs. They became parallel governments. Today's major cartels, including the Sinaloa cartel, Sijing, Los Zetas remnants, MS-13, and others, operate more like multinational corporations than street criminals. They have accountants, lawyers, logistics teams, recruiters, political liaisons, and international financial structures. They do not just cross borders, they manage them. And their single greatest threat is not law enforcement. It's border enforcement with public support, which is why their most powerful weapon is not violence, it's influence. Cartels learned a critical lesson over the last 2 decades. You do not defeat a superpower by force, you defeat it by turning its own people against its institutions. So they adapted. Instead of fighting the state directly, they embedded themselves in systems that influence public opinion. Migrant advocacy networks, legal aid groups, international NGOs, human rights coalitions, media-aligned activist organizations, and on the surface, many of these organizations appear compassionate, moral, and humanitarian. Some of them genuinely are, but many others function as logistical infrastructure for mass migration pipelines, knowingly or not. They provide transportation, legal shielding, housing coordination, documentation assistance, fundraising, narratives, political pressure campaigns, and in effect, they normalize and sanitize the cartel business model. Because what is human smuggling if not the most profitable industry on earth? And who controls human smuggling? The cartels. This is where the conversation becomes uncomfortable, because it challenges the moral self-image of modern activism. Cartels move people. NGOs move money. Media moves emotion. Politicians move policy. And together, they form a closed loop of incentive. The more chaos, the more fundraising, the more headlines, the more protests, the more political pressure, the weaker the border, the more people trafficked, the more profit for cartels. No single NGO has to be evil for the system to be corrupted. The system itself becomes the machine. And once billions of dollars flow through that machine, nobody wants it to stop. Not the NGOs who receive donations, not the lawyers who bill hours, not the politicians who harvest votes, not the media who harvest outrage, and certainly not the cartels who harvest human beings. Now enter the modern protester. They see a headline, they see a viral clip, they see a crying mother, they see a hashtag, and they feel emotion. But they do not see the cartel recruiter who promised the migrant a fake job, the smuggler who extorted their family, the rape houses along the journey, the debt bondage contracts, the money laundering banks, the child trafficking rings, or the fentanyl distribution pipelines. They are shown only the final frame of the movie, never the entire plot. They are trained to think in binaries: good versus evil, victim versus oppressor, compassion versus cruelty. They are not taught to think in systems, and so they become emotionally reactive but strategically blind. The result? They protest the very institutions trying to dismantle the criminal networks that created the suffering in the first place. They scream at border agents while ignoring traffickers. They demonize enforcement while empowering exploitation. They chant about justice while protecting the most violent organizations in the Western Hemisphere. Not because they are bad people, but because they have been psychologically engineered to feel without understanding. And here is the truth no activist sign will ever tell you. Cartels do not care about race. They do not care about human rights. They do not care about social justice. They do not care about asylum. They do not care about ideology. They care about control. They traffic women. They enslave children. They extort families. They dissolve enemies in acid. They execute journalists. They infiltrate police forces. They assassinate mayors. They run rape factories. They harvest organs. They recruit child soldiers. And they use humanitarian narratives as camouflage, because nothing protects evil better than moral language. The darkest irony in all of this is that the people most harmed by cartel-enabled systems are the very people activists claim to defend. Migrants are robbed, raped, trafficked, extorted, enslaved, indebted, blackmailed, murdered. But that part of the story never trends. What trends is outrage at enforcement. What trends is anger at borders. What trends is emotional theater. The suffering that actually happens before the border is ignored because it implicates the cartels, not the state. And the cartels must never be the villain in the story, because that would collapse the entire narrative economy. This conversation is not really about ICE. It is not about one agency. It is not about one policy. It is not about one protest. It is about whether Americans are capable of thinking systematically instead of emotionally, asking who profits instead of who feels offended, understanding the criminal strategy instead of repeating slogans, seeing manipulation instead of mistaking it for virtue, and seeing manipulation instead of mistaking it for virtue. Because once a society cannot distinguish compassion from control, it becomes infinitely exploitable. And right now, America is being exploited by cartels, by propaganda networks, by financial interests, by narrative engineers, by systems that profit from disorder, not through invasion, but through persuasion. So the real question is not, are you pro-ICE or anti-ICE? The real question is, are you thinking or are you being managed? Because every cartel on earth knows the truth. A nation that loses control of its borders will eventually lose control of its economy, its security, its institutions, its culture, and finally, its sovereignty. And the easiest way to make that happen is to convince its own people that enforcement itself is immoral, not through force, but through ignorance dressed up as righteousness. That is the real threat, and it's already inside the gates. Thanks for listening.